You're going to be in the budget.
All right.
That's all right.
It's a loud antitrust crowd.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, can we do better? Good morning, everyone. Excellent. My name is Neera Tanden, and I am president of the Center for American Progress and the Center for American Progress Action Fund. And I am thrilled to welcome you to this incredibly important discussion of how our economy is working and not working for people. We are currently living through what some experts have called a new Gilded Age, a time of rising market concentration across many different sectors of our economy. Our two very distinguished guests for today will discuss how this problem may be stifling competition for business, hurting American families, and damaging our very democracy. We are thrilled to welcome Senator Amy Klobuchar, who has established herself as a progressive champion across a wide range of issues, and as ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights. She is championing efforts to protect consumers, promote greater competition, and fight corporate consolidation. Our second guest, the Honorary Robert Reich, was Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration and is now Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the Goldman School at Cal Berkeley. Secretary Reich has focused public attention on growing inequality, even starring in a fantastic movie, Inequality for All, and we are thrilled to have him. I'm going to get right into today's discussion. We'll have a discussion up here, and then we'll have questions from the audience a little later in the program. So let me just start off with you, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Neera.
Later this afternoon, the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust, where you serve as a ranking member, will hold a hearing featuring Secretary Reich as one of its witnesses. What are you hoping the American people will learn from the hearing, and what is your focus on antitrust?
Okay, well, thank you for having me, first of all. And I've been here before talking about antitrust, but not with the Secretary. And I want to thank him for coming out here for our hearing today, and also for his very cool video about antitrust. Because I think one of our goals here, if you ask what the goal is for the hearing, it is to make antitrust cool again, to make people realize that we are, in fact, not just heading into another Gilded Age. When you look at the consolidation, several trillion-dollar companies now in this country, 50% increase in mergers, markets like online travel, where 93% of all those websites you look at to get good deals are owned by only 2 companies. We're down to 4 companies for rail, Class 1 rail. And we are in a situation in pharmaceuticals where time and time again, where you see these huge increases like with insulin and other drugs, where in fact it isn't just because it's one industry, it's because we're seeing consolidation across the board. So that's why it's really important for Americans to focus on this, and there are solutions out there. The solutions probably are not going to be at the Supreme Court. Alert, given what's been happening. So I think there are legislative solutions that we'll be talking about later today. So
Great.
Thank you.
Great. And you'll be testifying, Professor Reich, and what is the gist of your focus today?
Well, Neera, first of all, let me thank you and the Center for American Progress for hosting this and for your leadership with regard to all sorts of progressive issues. And Senator Klobuchar, I want to thank you for your leadership also on antitrust. Among many other issues, you've got a couple of bills in there that I find enormously important. One that would prohibit drug companies from essentially making deals with generic companies, drug companies, for delaying, pay for delay, the generic pharmaceuticals, which just is a piece of this larger problem of abuse of market power. And Neera, let me just say that in the early part of the 20th century, in that first sort of Gilded Age, when we saw monopolization as a result of huge technological changes. In fact, monopolization and technological change go together. This is one of the reasons we're seeing it again.
Great point.
The big debate in Washington was between regulation and antitrust. Teddy Roosevelt and Herbert Crowley, his advisor, basically said regulation. What you have to do is regulate, although, obviously Roosevelt was a trust buster. But the other view, Woodrow Wilson and his advisor Brandeis, Louis Brandeis, who eventually went to the Supreme Court, was antitrust. The best way of guaranteeing that the market worked was to make sure that there was competition, obviously. And so that's the debate we're having today. And we've got to face that those are the two choices.
Just and following up on that point, I wonder, Senator Klobuchar, if you could actually talk a little bit about the impact of the monopolization. A lot of people focus on consumer prices, but as we're seeing, monopolization can also drive down wages for people. It can have a range of effects. So essentially, why should Americans care about antitrust policy? How's it actually affecting them? The fact that we have so many mergers happening.
Sure. First, let's look at a positive. The breakup of AT&T, remember that? That was a major antitrust case. Took a lot of work. And what happened there was you saw more innovation. You saw lower prices for consumers in the long-distance market. I know a little bit about it because I was in the private sector back then, and I represented MCI, which was kind of the Wild West, trying to get in the market at the time. So now you fast forward to today, where you're not seeing that kind of vigorous enforcement, and mostly a lot of the cases that are brought, including the recent AT&T Time Warner case, a little bit in the news yesterday, which we can maybe get to in a moment. But you see courts striking things down, not just that, but more and more conservative justices who are not upholding, in my mind, the tradition of the antitrust laws. So what you see then for consumers is you don't see the kind of lower prices you'd see if you had competition. You also don't see innovation, and that is something that people don't always think about. But in fact, it was Adam Smith, when you go back to the founding of this country, when he talked about American capitalism, right, the father of capitalism, he always talked about monopolies and how dangerous monopolies were and why you needed a counterbalance to monopolies. And when you go back through history, as the Secretary was talking about, you see that this was something that was literally at the core of the founding of our country, because the colonists, yes, they didn't like to be taxed without representation, but they also didn't like the monopoly that they were getting on tea from the East Indian Tea Company. They wanted to be able to sell their tea to anyone that they wanted. So there are all these antitrust roots in the history of our country where people stood up, farmers in the Midwest, the Granger movement. I'm actually doing a book on this myself that Knopf is doing, that I've been researching the last year, and you just see these parallels with where we are today. And that's why when you look at why people should care about it today, you do look a little back in history, because you realize people stood up and did something and things improved, but you also look at the prices. When you have lack of choices in certain area, that's not good. When you have no innovation, what does that mean, like in the seed area, as we look at climate change coming our way? If there's not innovation, if there's not competition, then you're going to have companies just relying on their own products. Why would they develop new products if they can just rely on the old ones and make a ton of money because they have a monopoly on the market?
Just building off on that point that Senator Klobuchar made, and it just references something you said earlier, which is we seem to have, when you go back to history, you have a similar moment where you had the industrial age, which was a lot of kind of innovation, and then monopoly power. I think a lot of people raise the same question about today. We are facing an information age where technology has radically changed the economy, and we have a whole series of new companies, tech companies, which in many people's eyes are sort of the front and center picture, particularly with all the debates we've had in Washington. And I wonder, what is the connection between technological innovation and monopoly, and are there special tools we need in this new moment?
Well, there are slight differences, obviously, between the 1890s and now. But the high-tech companies display a different kind of monopolization than what we saw then. Then the monopolization had to do with railroads and steel and oil and the kind of natural, so-called natural monopolies. Where you don't want to have two railroads parallel to each other, so you either had to regulate or you had to break them up in some way. What we see now are network effects. That is, you have giant the big four or the big five, depending upon how you define them, high-tech companies, all moving toward capitalization of pretty soon $1 trillion each. They have network effects in the sense that if you want to use Facebook, you've got to join Facebook. There's not another substitute for Facebook.
Yeah.
The barriers to entry are huge. There are also big data issues. Once you get a certain amount of big data, and they're all racing to be the lead of big data, it's very hard for anybody else to get in. There are also what's called monopsonistic issues, and that is you've got big companies in high tech, Amazon would be the best example, that are keeping suppliers and contractors. They have so much market power, they're pushing down what suppliers and also providers can get. But you see this,
wages.
Yeah, you see monopsonistic practices and power all across the economy now with regard to wages. And this is something that anybody who's concerned about, and I used to be Secretary of Labor, and obviously many people in this room are concerned about wages. You can't separate what's going on in the economy in terms of consolidation from the stagnation of wages.
I just want to, that is a very good point. And you look in the past, a lot of this was unions coming up, workers way back over 100 years ago. That's how this movement started, right? So now you have a whole different model. Instead of saying the typical antitrust problem is when like Coke and Pepsi would merge, right? So then there's no competition. But what this is, a monopsony, is companies that control things under them. And so that is, and then that allows them to better control the wages. You don't have competition. And I would add one more problem to this. And this isn't always in mergers. These are things that could be investigated so you can figure out what's going on. The other problem is that then these companies have so much power, right, that they can come to Washington. So when problems arise in their area, and I lived two, one, privacy issues with data, which is an obvious one, and then secondly, just their own product and how it's being used. It's very hard to get things done because you don't have the kind of competition or people scared, oh, if this company gets in trouble and Washington gets mad at this company, then there's another one out there. There's nothing out there. So then they come armed to Washington. Have we had any privacy legislation start? No. We don't. Kennedy and I introduced a bill. It's gone nowhere so far. We have a patchwork of bills, and they're complaining about that, so we may finally get privacy legislation. But I'm talking about things like breaches, things like how do you as a consumer find out? How do you opt out of your data? All of that, I believe, has not moved forward because of this situation where you have so much consolidation. And then the last thing I'd add is just the political advertisement, which was a whole nother subject for another day. But the fact that we've been so slow in trying to regulate that paid advertisement compared to TV, radio, and newspaper doesn't make any sense to me, and it is related to the consolidated power that they have.
So I'd love to just follow up on that because obviously the kind of prototypical example everyone has in their mind these days in the tech space is, I mean, there are many examples, but you could use, I think the one that's been in the headlines probably the most is Facebook. And so you've been an outspoken person, an outspoken senator, outspoken political leader on Facebook when a lot of people were actually pretty scared of talking about Facebook for the reasons you've talked about. You referenced privacy and other issues, but just if you can walk through a little bit in the specifics of how a company like Facebook is able to both continue its practice. And I think one of the challenges in the antitrust space is it's not charging a price to consumers. It's obviously charging a price to advertisers. And it's having a dominant force, not just in the market, but obviously on our democracy and our privacy. And so is that an example of how we have to rethink antitrust or bring in new issues into antitrust? Or is it just the traditional market, the traditional markers of cost to consumers are sufficient to think through these antitrust problems?
Well, first, the bills that I have right now are focused on mergers. So if a merger happens, one of the things it says in this legislation, which I think is important, is to start looking at monopsonies as one of the factors. It's looking at the big mega mergers and saying, if this happens, you should shift the burden. So the companies actually have to show that it doesn't materially hurt competition. So that would help in a merger situation. When you just look at the companies themselves and what's happening, I think that calls out for, as you're seeing across the world, investigations into whether or not there should be some consumer rules put in place. The merger legislation would help going forward. But the FTC has been looking at some of these things and then going at it, as I suggested, with the privacy rules. Not leaving anymore, we've just have your backs. Because the factors against us are huge. There's the factor of money and lobbying, which is present in a lot of these industries, of course. There's a big factor here of members not understanding it, okay? Maybe you noticed some of the questions, so, okay, so, you have that, and it is very, and on their half, I mean, it's very complicated, right? And you can make yourself look like an idiot pretty easily, so, so there's that. There's the inertia in Washington when you don't have a big crisis going on. They didn't do anything about Wall Street rules until we actually had that last crash. And so all of those factors are combining. But what I'm trying to say is we need to get ahead of this. It's so obvious when you look at people's data being stolen and what happened with Cambridge Analytica that we need to get ahead and work on these things. And there is starting to be more movement, especially the companies are now voluntarily doing some things. They have been smashed over the rocks for some of these things. And so hopefully we can get some bipartisan agreement that we have to move forward.
Did you want to respond to that?
Well, just let me say one other thing, and that is much of the job that the senator is doing, other leaders are doing in this space has to do with connecting the dots. Amazon gets $3 billion offer from New York City. Why? How does that affect competition? When big companies hold essentially competition sales around the country, you give me more or you give me more, that has a negative effect on smaller companies that can't enter into those kinds of competition agreements.
Yeah.
The same thing with, the senator mentioned, lobbying. There's also a big issue with freedom of speech because you've got these 4 or 5 huge information centers, information providers, they say just platforms. They're not just platforms. They're much more than platforms. And information has been weaponized, and we all know that. Connect the dots here about sort of the potential abuses of power and the actual abuses of market power, and you see that something has to be done.
Yeah, you say, for so long, every time we propose things like this, it was, you're trying to regulate the web. Ooh, as opposed to saying these are actually big media companies and your information is a commodity. That's what this is, okay?
Senator Klobuchar, I want to move to a different area. You've done a lot of work on the issue of prescription drugs. We've been proud to host you at CAP to focus on some of your legislation in that space. How do you see the overlaps between competition policy and issues like high drug prices?
Mm-hmm. There's a big overlap there. Again, some of these same factors with Washington not acting, inertia, and finally, if you look at that last election, 2018, farmer prices were front and center, and I'm hoping that is going to finally move some of this legislation. Some of it is broad antitrust, the things we were talking about before, about how we need to change the rules of the road, so we're as sophisticated as the titans that run these companies when it comes to our FTC and the Justice Department, but some of it is industry specific. For too long, pharma has thought that they've owned Washington, and I think we all know they do. But they don't own me, and they don't own a number of other people who have been starting to push for change. Ideas. One, we were just talking about it as we walked in, pay for delay, where big pharma is paying off generics to keep their products off the market. This is a bill I have that I'm leading with Senator Chuck Grassley, who now is in charge of the Finance Committee. So it should be in a place where we can finally put this, because it saves money if we stop that practice, about $2.9 billion over a number of years. And so we want to put that in some bill. It's a great pay for, as we call them in Washington, D.C., because it is a lot of money. Okay, that's one. Secondly, get less expensive drugs from places like Canada. You can do it like the bill I have, again, with Grassley. That was a bill with McCain, who I miss every day. But Grassley stepped into his shoes, and there are others. I think we had about a dozen Republican votes for something like that. And then the third one is to allow for Medicare negotiation, which could really help everyone if you unleash the power of 43 million seniors. And there's a lot of other ideas by my colleagues. I just put those out there. Those are the ones I've been working on for a while. But we have just seen no improvement. And when the administration put out their plan, the pharma prices, the stocks actually went up. So I don't know.
Following recent mergers, a handful of companies control 78% of the U.S. corn seed market. Speaking of farmers, I wanted to get to this. 78% of U.S. corn seed market and 70% of the international pesticide market. What does it say, Secretary Reich, what does it say about current markets and the rules we have established around them when even straightforward markets like agriculture, which are not technological innovation monsters or something, are subject to, have real challenges around competition?
Well, it tells you, Anita, that not only is this issue across the economy, but also that intellectual property is a big part of it. One of the reasons that you've got so much concentration in the seed corn area of agriculture is Monsanto and it's basically intellectual property, predatory use of intellectual property, which means that many small farmers are being squeezed because you've got farm processors on the one hand who are consolidating like mad, pushing down the prices that farmers can sell their goods, their produce for. At the same time, you've got seed corn and a lot of fertilizers and other farm supplies that are consolidating, using predatory practices, using their intellectual property, and charging more and more. This is why this whole issue area ought to be bipartisan. This is the Farm Belt, with a lot of Republican senators and representatives, ought to be on top of this. Antitrust is not and should not be viewed as a Democratic or progressive issue. This gets to the heart of our free market system.
Yeah, you guys heard of the Sherman Act? Do you think Sherman was a Democrat or a Republican? He was a Republican from Ohio.
But I think
and Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican.
So I think this actually gets to what some of the fault lines on thinking these days. So antitrust is a means by which you make a market work better, right? So it is a theory of, it's a pro-capitalism tool to make markets work better for people. And yet we have so much opposition to, or people not doing anything, et cetera, because of the voice essentially of business lobbying. So how do we break through the theory that anytime government does anything, it's hurting the economy? Particularly in this arena, you have an example where antitrust is actually really just about using rules to make the economy work better. As you said, Republicans should be supporting these proposals. They should be bipartisan. In fact, they're pro-capitalist arguments for regulation, but we haven't seen Republicans or too many championing antitrust, particularly in this moment where we have such a large increase in monopolies that are affecting consumers and affecting wages. So how do we break through that? Do we talk about it? Is it a political discussion? Can we get Congress to act differently? Maybe I'll start with you, Secretary Reich, and then Senator Klobuchar, and then we'll get to some solutions and go straight to the audience.
I think partly it is a public awareness issue. Antitrust, you talk to people with their eyes glazed over. They don't know it. There's got to be an understanding that antitrust is not only vital to the maintenance of capitalism and our markets, but also it's cool, as the senator said initially, and that it is the sole alternative we have to regulation. that if we are not going to use antitrust creatively, and I'm not saying just bust up everything. There are a lot of other things you can do. You could have mandatory licensing, you could have sharing of data, you could do a lot of things. But if we're not going to use antitrust, then you do have to depend on regulation. And those are the only alternatives because we can't sustain the direction we're going in.
It has to become part of the political dialogue. I'm hoping it will in this 2020 election. It seeped in through the pharma issue in 2018. But when you look back in history, it literally was a defining part of the campaigns. Wilson actually had a song about antitrust that people would
sing. He
sing.
sang it. It was not very, very good. It wasn't
okay, all right, okay. But
make the charts.
He had that. And you look at the video that the secretary has put out there. And there are a number of books coming out actually in the next year by a number of people on this topic. I just think we have to start talking about it again, making it simpler. I remember being in a cafe in Albert Lea, Minnesota, and this woman turned around. She was with her husband and her husband's brother, and they were older farmers. And she turned around, she said, "I saw you on TV." It was like a year and a half ago. And I go, "Oh," our staff is there. I go, "Was it about Russia?" Because I'd been doing all this stuff on Russia. She goes, "No, it was about big." And I go, "What?" She says, "Big, about how things are too big, and that's bad for us because it's bad because of the trains." And she started using examples of them with input costs for farms, basically, and why big was bad. And I thought, okay, that actually is something that she heard and listened to. So it is not crazy to start talking about antitrust. We just have to do it in a way that's understandable and get the media to be interested in it outside of one story about Donald Trump, which is important, trying to meddle and influence a legal decision. That's important, but what's really important is what all of this over a span of decades now is doing to consumers if we just sit back and do nothing.
So I hope people get ready for questions. Just going to ask each of you. We've talked a lot about challenges and some about solutions. But if you wanted to just, Senator Klobuchar, discuss your proposals in this space and why you think they'll be helpful.
Sure. I mentioned the drug proposals. I would add one more. That's actually a Leahy, Grassley, Klobuchar-Lee bill, which is CREATES Act. And that has a possibility of passing this year. That's about trying to make pharmaceutical companies give samples of their drugs to generics so that we can get more generic competition out there. But the bigger antitrust solutions to me are two bills that we've worked on over a period of time. Right now, unfortunately, they only have Democratic co-sponsors. But one is to increase the fees on mega mergers. This would be a drop in the bucket for these companies when it's between $2 to $5 billion for a transaction, and it would allow us to then have these fees that could be used to finance more sophisticated reviews of these mergers from the FTC and from the Justice Department. That has some possibility of bipartisan support depending on how we do it, because it's not coming out of the taxpayers' money, it's coming out of these mega mergers. And we clearly need resources in these areas. The second one is, as I mentioned, to change some of the standards to match our changing times, to switch the burden of proof so that a company for these big financial transactions has to actually show it doesn't materially reduce competition, to start looking at monopsonies as a factor, to switch the standard from substantially reduce competition to materially reduce competition. Those are all contained in one of the bills we have with a number of co-sponsors. I'm not out there alone, but talking about this and getting this out there would be very helpful.
Mr. Reich, do you have additional thoughts?
Well, let me just say that there is no issue I can think of that combines populism and conservative free market principles better than antitrust. Let's hope that Republicans begin to understand the power of antitrust. We cannot take the free market for granted. There are sectors of this economy that are hurling toward a degree of concentration of economic and political power that we have not seen in this country since the 1890s. It's dangerous for our markets, it's dangerous for our politics, and antitrust is one of the most important weapons we could have.
Great, thank you. All right, we have time for questions. Wait for the mic, and if you want to identify yourself, that'd be really helpful. And just try to make the questions as quick as possible.
Mike Golash, the Amalgamated Transit Union. One of the things that you haven't really addressed is that there's an awful lot of laws in this country which limit the ability of workers to act collectively. Taft-Hartley, secondary boycotts, things which would give workers more leverage in dealing with some of these issues. I'd like you to address that a little bit.
Sure. Maybe we'll let the Secretary of Labor start, huh?
Well, worker organizing is the flip side to antitrust, because what we've seen since, certainly over the last 50 years, is that as antitrust has receded, labor laws have not protected worker organizing, and workers have less and less bargaining power. So if you wanted a cartoon version of an answer to why profits as a percentage of the national economy have continued to rise, and wages as a percentage of the national economy have continued to fall, the simple version would be bargaining power on the side of very large corporations has increased, bargaining power on the side of labor has continually decreased. So that's just a long-winded way of saying you're right.
Senator Klobuchar, do you want to say something?
I don't know what I can add to that. You're right. But that it is that power. So as I was listening to the Secretary and you, I was thinking this is a very interesting way to go at this in terms of explaining this. The major power at the top then squeezes out the workers because it means that they don't have as much to bargain with. That's all it is. They don't have other companies they can go work at, right, if you only have one or two of them. And you add to that the pushback from states like my neighboring Wisconsin in the past, on labor laws, and you have a situation where workers are basically getting screwed because of the consolidation at the front. And you look at it historically, as Secretary Reich knows, that is actually, it came up together, right? The Haymarket riots, what happened in Chicago, as the farmers were protesting with the Granger movement, about what was happening with their prices, and they had no way to go to get things to market. The workers were protesting along a lot in the industrial Midwest about what was happening with their wages when you had these companies like Pullman, right, that were controlling everything about their lives, and they were not able to work anywhere. Their wages were down, and then that's what led to some better labor laws, but also antitrust. A lot of the focus of the workers was on antitrust.
Other questions? There's one, the one in the back, right back there. And just identify yourself.
Luther Lowe from Yelp.
Hello, Yelp.
Hello, Senator. I was curious.
Did you say Yelp or Yale?
Yelp.
Got it. Two different things.
I was curious, so I kept
Tell
telling
them your job with Yelp so everyone knows who you are out there.
I'm the SVP of Public Policy. I've been kind of keeping loose track of how often we talk about Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and just out of curiosity kept tally and noticed we mentioned Facebook 5 times, Amazon once, and Google 0 times. So my question's about Google. We have a Google representative appearing alongside the Secretary in the hearing later today who's kind of triple dipping on their payroll. Google was the biggest spender in Washington last year, and while we're in the house that John Podesta built, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos were not sending lengthy campaign memos to the Clinton campaign years before the election. Eric Schmidt was, and so they have this unique kind of obsession with soft capture. So my question is, do you think that, in your opinion, both to the Secretary and the Senator, has the 2013 decision to close the investigation into Google's unilateral conduct aged well, and should the FTC reopen that investigation?
Well, I would like to see an investigation. We have talked about this. Certainly you don't want to just stop things back in the year 2013 when you've seen changes, and you've seen changes across the world in how they are looking at the activities of the Google and the other social media platforms. So I don't think that was our witness, right? Is that right? How did that all work, of who the witnesses were at the hearing? Yeah, okay, they're going, no, says Mark, no. But in any case, that will be ripe for asking questions about this this afternoon. And I thank you for your work. As you know, Yelp has been out there on the cutting edge, trying to get in the market and understands the issue of what it's like every day. And this is one example. We have so many companies. I think people think of, oh, this is antitrust, and consumer groups are the only ones that are coming to Washington about it, as they should. But there's a lot of companies that feel that non-enforcement, allowing things to go as they are, hurts new companies from getting in the market or expanding. And Yelp has a lot of examples of that.
In fact, the rate of new business formation, according to the Commerce Department, continues to drop. It's about half what it was in 2004. And I think the barriers to entry that we're talking about here with regard to these big companies, particularly big tech companies like Google, I'll mention Google very explicitly, have created, it made it difficult for the Yelps of the world to get in. Just one quick thing. When you say soft capture, that was the verb or the verb tense you used with regard to Google. It's an interesting way of talking about a kind of a predatory behavior. When Google subsidizes, for example, the New American Foundation, and then takes money away or threatens to take money away if the New American Foundation investigates antitrust and researches antitrust, or Google has a huge number, according to the Wall Street Journal, of professors and researchers on its payroll who testify about antitrust and basically protect and defend its market power. That is an incursion on the marketplace of ideas. It's not just the marketplace. It's one of the most important marketplaces we have in this country, and I think that that is an abuse of power, quite frankly.
Great. Questions up here? Do I just somewhere on the aisle? Great. And just a reminder to say who you are and where you work.
Hi, my name is Madison. I'm a student at NYU's Washington, D.C. campus around the corner. And one of the things that I've been struggling with as a young person getting started in Washington is this idea of spending a life and a career as a dissenting voice. So I was wondering what advice the three of you have for young people who want to get it started in politics to combat this sense of outraged fatigue and keep fighting against political turmoil and against lobbying money to actually make the country better.
Go into antitrust. We really need dissenting voices. But I think you know the excitement going on right now of people that want to see change. You just don't have to go very far if you're here. When you saw what happened the day after the inauguration with millions of people marching, and you go through the last 2 years where people have been activated like never before. So I always tell people to get involved in campaigns. It doesn't always have to be the national campaign. Sometimes it's fun to get involved in a local issue where you can have more of a voice in a campaign, and then advocating for an issue that you care about. And I'm kind of kidding about antitrust, but I'm kind of not. So figuring out something you care about and getting involved in that, and it can be part of your whole job, or it can be something you're doing as a volunteer. But it's really a way to, I always, when I got out of school, I had some student loans, and I didn't go right into government, but I started doing campaigns and getting involved on the side, and then that led somehow to this. So there you go.
And if I could just add to that, Madison, if you're a dissenting voice and you dissent long enough and hard enough, and you convince enough people, you're no longer a dissenting voice. And I can speak from experience.
Amen. I'll just say one quick thing about this, which is that I know that we live in an incredibly cynical time, and things that happen every day make us much more cynical. But I have worked on legislation that was opposed by industry and opposed by an entire political party, and 25 million Americans have health care, even though they fought against it. And that was not perfection. It was part of a political process. But millions of people have health care because of that political process. And that is the way we make change in our country. And people who feed cynicism want you to stay home, and people who fight cynicism want you to get involved. Over there? Go ahead.
Yeah. Excuse me, Larry Checco, Senior Advisor to Serve USA. I think we really know what's wrong with this town. It's been bought, top to bottom. And Neera, mentioning health care. I really think that the Obama administration would have had a lot better chance of selling the ACA. Instead of calling it the American Health Care, they should have called it the American Health Insurance Reform, because nobody's really upset about their health care. It's their gatekeepers. It's the insurance companies. So I think had they branded it as health insurance reform rather than health care reform, but I think the reason that didn't happen was because there's too much health insurance money up on the Hill. And I think that's the problem. Would anybody care to speak to that?
Well, it has been the time-worn problem in Washington, and it's just been getting worse and worse. And there's things that we could do to fix this outside of antitrust our subject today. The first is to overturn Citizens United with a constitutional amendment. It sounds like a stretch, but not if we make democracy repair a major part of what's happening in 2020. And I think that would help immensely, because you would get the dark money out of politics and be able to at least hold people accountable for their own campaigns. You should make it easier for people to vote. And that is everything from, I have a bill to allow kids to automatically register if they're eligible when they turn 18, right? Pretty simple. To fixing the voting rights, do the reauthorization that we've been held back on. So I think actually I was one of the campaigns in Minnesota in 2018, Angie Craig, who's a new member of Congress who beat a Republican. She actually ran ads showing people trying to speak in front of a bale of hay, right? Her district is a combined suburban rural district, but you couldn't hear their voices because they'd been squelched by big interests. I think that district, by the way, is not a super liberal district, right? These issues transcend parties, and we just need people, and I know I'm going to do this, making it a centerpiece of what we do going forward to win in 2020. And the way you then get these changes made that we're talking about here is by getting people that are willing to make those changes into office.
If I could just add that H.R. 1 is a very important beginning with regard to some of these democracy issues.
I was thinking too, Senate, like H.R. 1 is the key.
And the democracy movement, the incipient democracy movement that has to do with getting big money out of politics, is intimately tied to this issue of antitrust. You can't separate them.
Outstanding. I think that is a fantastic end to this discussion. I want to thank you both for being here, but also thank you for championing issues that help families and our economy together. So thank you both,
All right.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, everybody.
Professor Reich.
We ask that everyone please remain in their seats while the Senator and Secretary exit. Thank you. Please remain in your seats.
Come on over. You don't remain in your seats. You guys because I think you'd be just an interview.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys. Thanks. If you have any questions here, these guys are really smart. They work with me, Ajay and Mark. And Mark's at the FTC, and I can reach out to our office. So, thank you.
Senator Klobuchar announced her candidacy for president several weeks ago, and you can see that and this conversation from this morning if you go to our website, cspan.org, type Amy Klobuchar in the search box to see all of her appearances on the C-SPAN networks. Well, the House and Senate will be quite busy over the next few days and a few weeks. Debate on a number of suspension bills today in the House with votes at 6:30.